My colleague always believes that every achievement I've made is thanks to him. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and the moment Mark smiled and called me his protege in front of the entire boardroom, something in me went cold. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Ethan's Way. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I had been with Langston Technologies for 6 years, long enough to earn a seat at the big table, but not so long that I'd become invisible to the people making decisions. I'd clawed my way here from a cubicle where I used to spend lunch breaks with a sandwich in one hand and training manuals in the other. Promotions had never been handed to me. Every achievement had a trail of late nights and weekends I'd given up. And yet somehow, according to Mark, I owed it all to him. Mark wasn't my boss. He wasn't even in my department when I first started. But somewhere along the way, he decided he was my mentor. In reality, that title was self-appointed, a badge he wore loudly in every meeting where my name came up. He had a gift for standing just close enough to other people's work to make it look like he'd built it himself. It wasn't just me. Others had felt it too, the way he'd drop by someone's desk with a suggestion, then repeat it to management as if he'd conceived it entirely. But with me, it was constant. That morning, the board had congratulated us on landing the Daxwell contract, the biggest client we'd brought in all year. I'd been the one leading the pitch, handling the calls, rewriting the proposal until 2 in the morning. I knew every comma in that presentation, yet when the CEO asked how we'd managed to close it, Mark stepped forward with that easy, confident smile and said, "Well, I've been guiding Ryan for a while now, and I'm proud to see him apply what I've taught." The room had chuckled politely. The CEO nodded, and I smiled. I didn't correct him. I didn't roll my eyes. I just let the moment settle, feeling it burn into me like a brand. Later in the hallway, one of the newer analysts clapped me on the back. "Man, it must be great to have a mentor like Mark." I laughed because if I didn't, the anger would have shown. Mark had a way of acting like my success was just an extension of his own greatness, as if I were a reflection, not a person. The problem was, people believed him. He was charming, well-spoken, the type who could talk his way into a corner office without ever finishing a project himself. That day, something shifted. I realized this wasn't just about credit anymore. It was about the story being written about me in this company, and if I didn't take control of it, I'd end up as a footnote in Mark's career instead of the author of my own. By the time I sat back at my desk, the decision had already formed. I wasn't going to confront him in the hallway or send a petty email. I was going to let him keep talking, keep taking credit, and I was going to make sure that when the truth came out, it would be undeniable. What I didn't know yet was how far Mark's reach extended or how far I'd have to go to stop him. It began almost imperceptibly, the way a single crack in glass is barely noticeable at first, but you know deep down that if you press on it, the whole thing will shatter. At first, Mark's little interjection sounded harmless. In the Monday strategy meeting, I'd outline a solution for an ongoing client issue, a solution I'd spent days refining, anticipating every possible follow-up question. The room would be nodding along, the director would be taking notes, and then Mark would lean back in his chair and add, "Yeah, Ryan and I discussed this last week over coffee." That coffee had never happened, but in that moment it didn't matter whether it had or not. The picture he'd painted was one of a trusted advisor and his eager protege working side by side. And it wasn't just in meetings. One Tuesday afternoon, a client emailed me final confirmation on a deliverable I'd been working on for months. I drafted a clean, concise reply, triple-checked for clarity, and hit send. The next morning, I discovered the same email in my sent folder, only it had been forwarded from Mark's account, just adding a little polish before sending. His polish was 2 sentences rearranged and my closing replaced with one of his trademark lines. But the optics were perfect for him, and now looked like my work had been filtered, approved, and essentially endorsed by him before leaving the building. When I asked about it in the break room, he clapped me on the shoulder, grinning like we were teammates. "Don't worry about it, man. You did great. I just made sure the tone matched what leadership likes to see." I tried to laugh it off, but inside, something twisted. This wasn't mentorship. It was infiltration. The incidents began stacking like bricks. A few days later, I learned he'd attended the steering committee meeting for my project. I wasn't invited. When I asked our manager why, she looked surprised. "Oh, I thought you'd given Mark the go-ahead to present the update on your behalf. He said you were buried in other priorities." That was a lie. I decided to confront him more directly, still casual, still testing the waters. "Hey Mark, I heard you gave an update on the system integration. Next time, can you loop me in? I'd like to be there for my own project updates. His expression didn't flicker. Of course, buddy. I just didn't want to overload your schedule. We're a team, remember? Your win is my win, that line. Your win is my win stuck with me. I realized it wasn't just a convenient excuse. It was his entire operating philosophy. The breaking point for the stage came during the quarterly all hands. My direct manager had prepared a slide recognizing my work on that grueling 6-month system integration, a project that had consumed my life and tested every ounce of my patience. The slide came up. My name was in bold. I felt a small rush of pride, until Mark stepped forward to the microphone. He thanked everyone for supporting our joint effort and cracked a joke about me being his apprentice since day one. The room laughed. The applause swelled. The CEO gave him that approving nod I'd been working years to earn. I forced myself to smile even as my jaw ached. After the meeting, my inbox lit up with messages, "Great job, Ryan. Mark. Tells me you've been learning a lot under his wing. The two of you make a fantastic team." Half of them CC'd Mark. That night, I sat on my couch with my laptop open, a blank document staring back at me. I started typing every instance I could recall of Mark stepping into my spotlight, every offhand comment, every hijacked email, every meeting where he positioned himself as my handler rather than my colleague. The list grew faster than I expected. In 6 months, he'd managed to insert himself into nearly every major success I'd had. It wasn't clumsy or desperate, it was methodical. He was rewriting my narrative inside the company line by line until the story wasn't about me anymore. It was about us. And the subtext was clear. Without him, I wouldn't be where I was. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how dangerous that was. In a place like Langston, technology's perception could be more valuable than performance. If enough people believed Mark was the architect of my work, he could control the trajectory of my career, decide which projects I got, which opportunities came my way, even whether I moved up or stayed put. This wasn't about bruised pride anymore. This was survival. I considered going to HR, but what would I say? That a colleague was being too supportive, that he was too involved in my work. Without proof, it would sound petty, even paranoid. No, if Mark wanted to make this a game of perception, I'd have to beat him at it. I'd need to become the quiet observer, cataloging, documenting, waiting for the moment when the mask slipped, because I had a feeling it would. One night, lying awake, I remembered something my father told me years ago. If someone keeps stealing your light, don't fight them in the dark and make them stand under the sun with you. It clicked then. Mark had been working in the shadows of half-truths and polite assumptions. My job now was to drag every interaction into the light, carefully, deliberately, until there was nowhere for him to hide. The first step was simple: stop letting him control the story. The second would take longer: make sure that when his version of events finally collapsed, it would be under the weight of his own words, not mine. And so, for the first time, I stopped reacting to Mark's moves. I started studying them. The day it happened started with a sense of anticipation. We were due to present our quarterly client engagement results to the executive team, a chance to showcase the measurable impact of the Daxwell integration, the project that had consumed months of my life and delivered results even the most optimistic forecasts hadn't predicted. I'd spent 2 weeks crafting the presentation. Every slide was sharpened down to the word, every graph chosen for clarity, every talking point rehearsed until it felt like breathing. My manager had given me the floor entirely. "You deserve this spotlight, Ryan." The morning of the meeting, I was in early, running through my notes in the empty conference room, the city skyline still pale in the dawn light. I remember feeling that small flicker of satisfaction, not arrogance, but the kind of earned confidence you get when you know your work is solid. At 9:00 a.m., the executives began filing in. There was the usual exchange of handshakes, polite laughter, the clinking of coffee cups on the table. My manager took a seat across from me, giving me an encouraging nod. Then Mark walked in. He wasn't supposed to be here. This was my presentation, my project. But he entered like he'd been invited, chatting easily with the CEO, pulling up a chair right beside me, as if we'd rehearsed this together. "Didn't know you were presenting today," I said quietly. "Oh, just here to support you," he murmured, flashing that practiced grin. "You know I've been following the project closely. Thought it'd be good to give a little context from the early stages." That was my first warning. When it was my turn to present, I stood feeling the familiar pulse of adrenaline. The first few slides went smoothly, engagement up 37%, client satisfaction scores at an all-time high, efficiency gains that exceeded projections. Heads were nodding, pens scribbling notes. Then Mark cleared his throat. "Ryan's done an outstanding job here." He began leaning forward in his chair, addressing the room like an invited co-presenter. When we first sat down to map out the integration, I remember telling him, "Keep the client involved at every milestone." And you can see here how that advice paid off. They felt ownership of the process. The room's attention shifted to him. Slide after slide, he inserted himself into the narrative, always with the phrasing of someone who was merely adding a little background, but each time placing himself at the origin point of the strategy. When I spoke about the system's automation upgrades, he chimed in, "Yeah, remember, when I suggested we run that trial phase before full deployment, saved us weeks." The executives were eating it up. By the time I reached the final slide, the applause that followed felt off. It was polite, yes, but it wasn't for me. And then came the gut punch. The CEO smiled broadly. "Excellent work, Mark. Ryan, great execution of Mark's vision. That's what teamwork is all about." My manager's smile faltered, but she said nothing. I felt my throat tighten, the blood rushing in my ears. I forced a smile, thanked them for their time, and sat down. Mark, of course, shook hands and accepted the praise like a man accepting a well-earned award. Afterwards, as the executives left, I caught fragments of their conversation. "Mark really knows how to develop people. He's building a strong team. Ryan's lucky to have that kind of leadership." Lucky, that was the word they used. I stayed in the room after everyone left, staring at the empty chairs, my hands gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles ached. This wasn't just another credit grab. This was a theft of perception of authority of the very narrative that defined my place here. If they believed he was the architect, then every success I delivered in the future would be chalked up to his influence. And one day, when the promotion list was being reviewed, they'd look at me and think Mark's protege, not quite ready yet. I knew then that quiet observation wasn't enough. If I kept letting him control the stage, there wouldn't be a stage left for me to stand on. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through my project files. I started pulling together a separate archive, not just the deliverables, but the email threads, the timestamps, the meeting invites that proved where the work originated. And then I remembered something else, the look on my manager's face when the CEO had called it Mark's vision. It wasn't surprise, it was resignation, like she'd seen this play out before. The next day, I invited her for coffee. I didn't accuse Mark outright. Instead, I asked a simple question. "Did you think Mark was involved in the Daxwell strategy from the beginning?" She hesitated. "Honestly, I've always thought of it as your project. But Mark, he's very good at making sure people think he's more involved than he is. You're not the first he's done this to." That was all I needed to hear. This wasn't just about me. By the end of the week, I'd spoken quietly with 2 other colleagues who'd had their credit siphoned off by Mark in the past. One described him as the shadow in the room, always there, always near the action, never the one doing the heavy lifting, but always the one remembered for it. The pieces were coming together. I didn't have the full plan yet, but I had the beginnings of something more important: allies. People who'd been where I was, people who knew the cost of letting someone like Mark keep building his empire unchecked. I decided then that my revenge, if you could call it that, wouldn't be loud or messy. It wouldn't be a dramatic confrontation in the middle of a meeting. It would be careful, deliberate, and irreversible. Because Mark wasn't just a credit thief. He was an operator. And to take down an operator, you can't just expose them. You have to dismantle the machinery they've built around themselves piece by piece until they have nothing left to stand on. From that day on, every interaction with him became part of a larger picture I was building. Every helpful suggestion he made, every meeting he crashed, every email he tweaked, it was all going into my growing collection of proof. And I wasn't just going to prove he didn't build my successes, I was going to prove that his own were built entirely on other people's backs. The next move was his, and I was ready. If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. If the humiliation in that boardroom had taught me anything, it was this: perception is a fragile currency. Once it's spent the wrong way, it's almost impossible to buy back unless you're willing to get creative. I'd stopped thinking of Mark as a colleague. He was now a project of his own, one that required careful dismantling. And the first step in any dismantling is knowing exactly where the screws are. For weeks I became a silent archivist. I saved every email that crossed my inbox with his name in it, especially the ones where he added context or polished my work. I took detailed notes after every meeting recording exactly who said what. I started using a personal time-stamped work journal, something only I had access to, that mapped the true chain of events for each project I touched. And because Mark was predictable, I knew exactly how to bait him. The first test came during a mid-level client rollout. It wasn't as high profile as the Daxwell deal, but it was complex enough to need coordination between multiple teams. I deliberately kept one small but visible part of the project slightly behind schedule, nothing that would hurt the outcome, but enough to trigger Mark's favorite instinct swooping in to save the day. Right on cue, 3 days before our check-in with the client, Mark appeared at my desk. "Everything good on your end?" His tone was light, but his eyes were scanning my open documents like a hawk. "Just a little hiccup in the analytics setup," I said, knowing full well it was already half resolved. "Should have it sorted by Friday." By Thursday afternoon, I received an email from the client, forwarded by Mark. "Hi Ryan, thanks for the update earlier." Mark walked us through the analytics plan and it looked solid. Excited for Friday's meeting. I read it twice, my jaw tightening. I hadn't given any update to the client. Mark had taken my half-complete work, pitched it as if he'd orchestrated the solution, and left me holding the bag for the final delivery. Perfect. Because I'd anticipated it, I'd also set up my own meeting with the client documented in our project management tool before his interference. And in that meeting, recorded with their consent for training purposes, I'd explained the exact analytics plan 2 days before Mark spoke to them, evidence neat and time-stamped. The more I paid attention, the more his patterns became obvious. He operated in 2 modes: preemptive credit, inserting himself early enough in a project's lifecycle to later claim the seed of an idea; opportunistic rescue, swooping in at the first hint of a problem to position himself as the solution. The brilliance and danger of his method was that neither approach was overtly malicious on the surface. If you weren't looking closely, it just looked like teamwork. That's what made my next step crucial. I needed allies who were looking closely. I started having quiet, off-the-record conversations with people who'd worked with Mark before. The stories were eerily consistent. One colleague recounted how Mark had attached himself to her project offering to help with a presentation, then later presented it solo when she was out sick. Another described how Mark convinced a junior developer to give him access to a prototype, which he then showcased to leadership as if it were his concept. By the end of the month, I had 5 people willing to confirm similar experiences. Still, I didn't confront him. I let him think I was still the same accommodating Ryan, still smiling, still thanking him for his support in meetings, still letting him hover over my work like an anxious parent. What he didn't know was that I'd begun tracking not just his actions, but his timing. When he replied to emails, when he appeared in my projects, when he scheduled informal chats with leadership, it painted a picture of a man who lived for optics. He wasn't in love with the work, he was in love with being seen near the work. The real turning point in my preparation came on a Tuesday evening, long after most people had gone home. I was in the office kitchen grabbing coffee when I heard a voice from the smaller conference room. The glass walls were half frosted, but the blinds were drawn. It was Mark. He was on the phone. "Yeah, I can send over the specs once the next phase is in motion. Not officially public yet, so keep it between us." I froze. Specs, next phase. He was talking to someone I didn't recognize, but the tone was the same slick, confidential charm he used on clients and executives alike. I didn't hear enough to know exactly what he was sharing, but it was enough to plant a dangerous seed in my mind. Mark wasn't just stealing credit. He might be leaking information. It took every ounce of restraint not to barge in. Instead, I made a mental note of the time, the date, and the fact that he'd closed the blinds. Now I had 2 objectives. The first was unchanged, reclaim my narrative, and dismantle his false reputation. The second was to find out exactly who was on the other end of that call. That night, I pulled out the same notebook where I'd been tracking his movements and drew 2 columns. One was labeled credit theft, the other suspicious activity. Under the second column, the list was short for now, but I had a feeling it wouldn't stay that way. From then on, whenever Mark inserted himself into my work, I didn't just record what he did, I recorded how he positioned himself afterward, who he spoke to, what language he used, whether the blinds in that conference room stayed open or closed, and slowly I began to see the shape of the trap I was building. It wouldn't be a single moment that brought him down. It would be an accumulation, a mountain of small, undeniable truths that no amount of charm could talk him out of. Until then, I played my role to perfection. I smiled in meetings. I let him have his little moments of mentorship. I even thanked him in front of others, not because I meant it, but because the bigger his ego grew, the more careless he would become. And when the time came, I would be ready to pull the ground right out from under him. If you were in this situation, would you keep collecting evidence like I did, or confront someone like Mark immediately? Comment below to share your thoughts. If there's one thing I've learned about people like Mark, it's that they always think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. They believe they can talk their way out of anything, that charm and confidence are bulletproof armor. But armor has cracks, and Mark's were starting to show. It happened late on a Thursday evening. The office was nearly empty that in-between hour when the sun had set, but the janitorial staff hadn't arrived yet. I'd stayed behind to finish finalizing a project plan for a new client, a contract worth several million, the kind of account that could make or break a quarter. The quiet was almost comforting. My desk lamp cast a warm glow over my notes, the city lights glittering through the glass walls of the 14th floor. That's when I heard it again, Mark's voice. It was coming from that same small conference room where I'd overheard him before. The blinds were drawn. I froze, not wanting to alert him, but I positioned myself just far enough down the hall to catch his voice when it lifted. No, they don't know yet. We're positioning it like an internal initiative for now. Once the rollout's confirmed, I'll make sure you have the framework. I frowned, the pen in my hand forgotten. Rollout wasn't a word we threw around casually. It meant something formal, something official. And framework sounded like internal architecture. Then he said a name I didn't recognize, Halden, followed by something that made my stomach knot. Look, Halden, you're gonna love this. They've got no clue about the cross-platform migration yet, so if you get in early, you'll have a leg up on the entire market. Cross-platform migration. That was one of our most closely guarded strategic initiatives for the upcoming fiscal year. Only a handful of people in leadership even knew the full scope, and Mark was on the phone discussing it with, who exactly? A partner, a friend, a competitor. My first instinct was to take out my phone and hit record, but I knew how risky that was without context. I didn't want to risk a recording that was too vague to prove anything. Instead, I glanced at the small digital clock mounted on the wall. 7:42 p.m. I wrote it down along with the date and every phrase I could remember. By the time I returned to my desk, my mind was racing. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the company. If Mark was leaking strategic information, it could put us in legal jeopardy, not to mention cost us millions. But here was the problem right now. I had nothing concrete, just a partial conversation and my own suspicion. If I went to leadership with this, Mark would deny it, accuse me of paranoia, and probably use it to paint me as the unstable one. I needed more, so I started adjusting my approach. My previous plan to catch him stealing credit and dismantle his image wasn't enough anymore. Now every move had to be calibrated toward uncovering the truth about his outside connections. The first step was to quietly verify whether this Halden had any legitimate ties to our company. A quick search through the internal directory turned up nothing. No vendors, no consultants, no partners by that name. That meant one of two things: either Halden was an alias, or he was completely external to the company. The second step was harder. I had to get close enough to Mark to anticipate when he might make another call like that without tipping my hand. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I started playing into his mentorship narrative. At lunch the next day, I joined him at the table in the cafeteria. "Hey, I've been thinking about getting your input on the new client onboarding," I said casually. "Maybe you can help me refine it before I present it to leadership." He lit up. "Absolutely. I'll block some time this week." That was exactly what I wanted. The more involved he felt, the more likely he'd let his guard down around me. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed a pattern. His mysterious calls always happened after hours when the office was nearly empty. Twice, I made an excuse to stay late, and both times I saw him slip into the small conference room with his phone. I couldn't hear much the first time, but the second time I caught enough to recognize the same tone he'd used before, the measured confidence of a man delivering something valuable to someone on the other end. I wrote everything down, every date, every approximate length of the call, every fragment of language I caught. My notes were starting to form a timeline, and then unexpectedly I caught my break. It was a Tuesday morning, and Mark was unusually tense. He came into the office later than usual, heading straight for the printer, with a thick packet of documents. I watched from my desk as he stuffed them into a slim leather folder. An hour later, he approached me. I've got an off-site lunch meeting, might be back later than expected. He didn't offer details, I didn't ask. But I waited until he was gone, then casually checked the printer queue history. The files he'd printed weren't labeled, but the metadata, the file names, were enough to make my pulse quicken. They were drafts of our cross-platform migration architecture. I sat back in my chair, staring at the monitor. If he was taking those to an off-site lunch meeting, there was no legitimate reason I could think of that didn't involve sharing proprietary information. The trap I'd been building in my head suddenly had a much bigger target. I wasn't just going to take Mark down for stealing my credit anymore. I was going to make sure that when he fell, it was for everything he'd done to me, to my colleagues, and possibly to the company itself. But I knew better than to rush. If I went after him without airtight proof, I'd lose. So I kept playing the role, the eager mentee, the loyal colleague. Inside, though I'd shifted, this wasn't personal revenge anymore. This was war. If you were in my position, would you go to leadership right away, or keep gathering evidence until you had an airtight case? Comment below to share your thoughts. Once I realized the scale of what Mark might be doing, every conversation with him became a performance. And like any good performance, it required a convincing script. I made a point of leaning into the mentorship role he'd carved out for himself. I'd stop by his desk with mock uncertainty about certain project elements. I'd phrase questions in a way that suggested I needed his wisdom. Mark, I'm not sure if this integration timeline is too aggressive. What do you think? Do you think leadership would prefer? I pitch it this way or soften it a bit first. He lapped it up each question, feeding the narrative that I was reliant on his input. And in return, I got what I needed: access to his patterns, his habits, and his tells. But I also needed to know if he was actually leaking company information, and if so, how. That's when I came up with the idea of controlled leaks. The concept was simple: feed Mark pieces of non-critical, slightly altered project details and see if they turned up somewhere they shouldn't. It had to be information that wouldn't harm the company if it got out, but that was specific enough to act as a marker. The first test was on a mid-tier client onboarding plan. I casually mentioned to Mark that we were considering adding an international trial phase before going live, something I'd completely made up. I even drafted a mock outline for it and left it in a folder labeled Draft Internal Only on our shared server. 3 days later, I overheard a snippet of conversation from a vendor rep during a networking call. So I hear you guys might be testing international rollout before the official launch. I froze, forcing my voice to stay even. Where'd you hear that? Oh, just something Mark mentioned in passing when we were talking about your project. Confirmation. It wasn't conclusive proof for leadership yet, but it told me two things. One, Mark couldn't resist sharing insider tidbits, and two, my bait strategy worked. I refined it with each round. For the next test, I invented a shadow migration plan, again harmless, but plausible, and mentioned it only to Mark in a one-on-one strategy session. 2 weeks later, a consultant friend outside the company mentioned hearing about a possible parallel migration from someone in the know. The breadcrumbs were lining up. While I was running these tests, I was also strengthening my network of quiet allies inside the company. I had coffee with Danielle from marketing, who'd once had a sponsorship project hijacked by Mark and repackaged as his brainchild. I shared just enough about my own experiences to let her know I understood, but not so much that it seemed like I was on a witch hunt. Danielle in turn connected me with Greg from product development, a meticulous, quietly observant man who'd kept copies of his original proposals after Mark had revised them, stripping Greg's name from the credits. Bit by bit, I was building a coalition not to confront Mark directly, but to stand as corroborating witnesses when the time came. The turning point came when a high-profile project codenamed Atlas landed on my desk. Atlas was big enough to warrant executive oversight from day one. Normally, I'd have been thrilled, but I knew it would be a magnet for Mark, so I decided to make Atlas my endgame. From the start, I documented everything, every meeting, every draft, every internal discussion. I saved version-controlled files in my personal drive, keeping the shared folders deliberately sparse and sanitized. When Mark inevitably came sniffing around, I fed him 2 different pieces of exclusive information at different times. One was about a supposed beta testing location in Chicago, the other a special pricing model for early adopters. Then I waited. The Chicago beta leak came back first through a casual remark from a supply chain contact I trusted. The pricing model took longer, but 2 weeks later a junior analyst in finance mentioned hearing about it from Mark during a coffee break. Both markers confirmed the same thing: he was a pipeline. and he didn't even realize I was using him to map exactly where the leaks went. But my game wasn't just about catching him talking. It was also about understanding his rhythm when he felt safest, when he overplayed his hand. I noticed he became bolder after small public wins, moments where leadership praised him for helping on something high visibility. That was when he'd start talking more freely, dropping hints to the wrong people. So I set him up for one of those small wins. I let him advise me on a minor Atlas-related pitch to mid-level managers, letting him believe he'd given me the magic touch that sold it. He basked in the praise for 2 days. On the third night, he was back in that small conference room, blinds drawn. I couldn't hear much, but I caught 2 words that sent a jolt through me: Atlas and framework. I didn't need the full sentence to know he was talking about my project. This time, I didn't just take notes. I discreetly walked to the far end of the hall, where one of our security cameras had a partial view of that conference room door. I knew from past requests that leadership could access those recordings if needed, and if the timeline of his private calls matched my logs, it would be one more nail in the coffin. By now, my archive was substantial email threads showing him claiming partial or full credit for my work, version histories proving I'd authored key deliverables before his edits, witness accounts from colleagues with similar experiences, controlled leak traces leading directly back to him, suspicious activity logs matching his after-hours calls to project milestones. And yet, I still played the role of the grateful mentee. Every time I thanked him in front of others, it wasn't submission, it was rope. Rope he didn't even realize he was wrapping around himself. The day was coming when I'd pull it tight, but not yet. Mark thought he was still running the game. That was fine with me, because the higher he climbed on the scaffolding of his own lies, the harder the fall would be. If you were in my position, would you have already exposed him? Or would you wait until every single piece lined up perfectly? Like I did, Atlas moved from planning to execution faster than anyone expected. The client's board had approved our proposal without revisions, a rare win in this business, and the timeline compressed overnight. That meant more visibility, more meetings with top brass, and more chances for Mark to try to weave himself into the spotlight. It also meant I had to accelerate my endgame. By now, my evidence folder was a living thing. It grew with each interaction: Mark's fingerprints on my work, the proof of my authorship, the controlled leaks that circled back to him like clockwork. But proof in a folder is just potential. It needed a stage, and the Atlas project was that stage. The first step was to make sure leadership saw me as the central figure in Atlas without making it look like I was campaigning for credit. That's a tricky line to walk. If you push too hard, you look insecure. If you don't push at all, you vanish from the narrative. So I became the voice of Atlas in every meeting. I sent out concise, high-value updates to the entire leadership thread after each milestone update, so clear that no one could add to them without it being obvious. I made myself the point of contact for every vendor, every department lead, every external query. And yet, I left deliberate openings. A document here that was 90% finished but not marked as final. A slide deck missing one key chart with the space left blank. These weren't mistakes. They were bait. Mark took it every time. He'd swoop in with a flourish. I filled in that last chart for Ryan, or I wrapped up the document so it was ready to go. And every time I'd quietly attach my original time-stamped version to my archive. But this wasn't enough. I needed him to overplay his hand in a way that leadership couldn't ignore. That's when I designed the executive preview. The preview was framed as a dry run of the final Atlas pitch, meant to show executives our progress and get their blessing before the official client presentation. It would be in person with the CEO, COO, and several VPs in attendance. In reality, it was a stage for Mark to walk into his own undoing. I invited him to be part of the preview team, not as the lead, but as someone who'd helped shape the strategy. I made it sound like a compliment. His ego did the rest. Then I planted one more controlled leak. In a one-on-one with him, I mentioned a contingency deployment model, a plausible but entirely fabricated piece of strategy. I framed it as a secret option I was considering revealing to the executives if they asked about scalability. I put nothing about it in writing, no emails, no files, just that conversation. If it came up in the preview, there would be only one way it could have gotten there. The day of the executive preview, the tension in the room was palpable. I opened the presentation, walking through our metrics, projected ROI, and rollout phases. Everything was sharp rehearsed and designed to leave little room for interruption. But interruptions were Mark's specialty. Halfway through the Q&A, the COO asked about scalability, specifically how we'd handle sudden demand spikes. I was about to respond when Mark leaned forward, smiling like a man about to deliver a magic trick. Well, one of the things I've been guiding Ryan on, he began, is a contingency deployment model that would allow us to... And there it was, my fake strategy laid out with all the confidence in the world. I let him speak for a full minute before I tilted my head slightly. That's interesting, Mark. Well, could you clarify where you got those figures? Because that particular approach hasn't been part of any approved plan so far. The room went still. The CEO looked from me to Mark. It hasn't? I shook my head, calm and steady. No, it was a theoretical scenario I mentioned in passing as a brainstorming point. It was never documented or vetted. Mark's smile faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. The COO scribbled something in his notebook. The VP of Strategy cleared his throat. Mark, can we discuss afterward how this idea ended up in the conversation today? The rest of the meeting continued, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. For the first time, Mark wasn't being treated like a co-architect. He was being treated like a liability. Afterward, my manager caught up with me in the hallway. That was smart, she said quietly. You handled it without making a scene. She had no idea that the scene had been meticulously staged weeks in advance. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. Mark wasn't CC'd on certain emails anymore. He wasn't pulled into side discussions with leadership. And when he tried to hover over my desk, it was with a forced casualness that didn't quite land. But I wasn't done. This was just the first visible crack in his armor. The final phase was coming, the one where every piece of evidence I'd collected, from the smallest stolen credit to the most suspicious leak, would be laid out in a way that even the most skeptical executive couldn't ignore. For now, I stayed the course. I thanked Mark for his contributions in meetings. I let him feel like he still had influence. But behind the scenes, I was tightening every screw, aligning every timeline, preparing for the moment when his entire story would collapse under its own weight. And when that moment came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. The truth would speak loudly enough. If you were in my position, would you have staged the trap like this or gone directly to leadership with the leak? After the executive preview incident, the shift in Mark's demeanor was subtle but telling. He still smiled the same way in meetings, still offered his mentorship like candy, but there was an edge now, a watchfulness. I could feel him recalculating, trying to figure out if I had meant to undercut him that day, or if it had just been an unfortunate misunderstanding. I made sure to feed the illusion that it had been accidental. Sorry about the confusion in the preview, I said casually one afternoon while grabbing coffee. Guess I should have been clearer that the contingency model was just spitballing. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. No harm done. We're a team, right team, always with that word. But a man like Mark doesn't like losing even a sliver of control, and it didn't take long for him to try to reclaim it. 2 weeks later, we were preparing for a major Atlas milestone meeting with the client's executive board, a high-stakes, high-visibility checkpoint that would essentially determine whether the project moved forward to full-scale rollout. I was scheduled to lead the meeting. My manager had made it clear in the invite, primary presenter Ryan Mitchell. The morning of the meeting, Mark appeared at my desk in his usual just-dropping-by stance. Hey, I was thinking, since I've been so involved in the strategy side, maybe I can kick things off for you. Warm up the room. I smiled, keeping my voice light. Sure, if you want to introduce the project history, I'll take it from the rollout section onward. He grinned like I just handed him a trophy. Perfect. What he didn't know was that I'd already anticipated this move. In fact, I'd set the stage for it. A week earlier, I had prepared 2 versions of the milestone deck. The real one, tight, precise, approved by leadership. The decoy polished enough to look credible, but containing 2 deliberate errors that would be obvious to the client and embarrassing to whoever presented them. The decoy deck had been quietly left in a shared folder Mark had access to, labeled Final Draft Atlas Milestone. The real one was on my personal drive. Sure enough, as soon as the meeting began, Mark took the floor. He started with his usual brand of casual authority, thanking everyone for their time, reminding them of the vision he'd helped shape. Then he clicked to the second slide and the first error landed. It was a chart that showed the client's projected cost savings, but the baseline figures were from an outdated financial model. It made the savings look smaller than they actually were. I saw the client's CFO frown slightly. Mark kept going, oblivious. He hit the 6th slide, the second error, a deployment timeline that didn't match the contract terms. The COO of the client side leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table. I let it hang for a moment, then cleared my throat. If I could jump in here, I said smoothly. I think we're working off an earlier draft. Mark froze. What? I smiled, pulling up my laptop and connecting it to the display. Here's the latest approved version. The corrected chart appeared savings 15% higher than what he just presented. Then the accurate timeline aligned perfectly with the agreed terms. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The client's CFO leaned back, visibly relieved. The COO nodded. Much better, the CFO said. Glad to see you're on top of the details, Ryan. I kept my tone neutral. Of course, accuracy is key in these discussions. Mark sat down slowly, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. The rest of the meeting went flawlessly. By the time we wrapped, the client board had given enthusiastic approval to move forward. As we filed out, my manager caught my eye and gave a small nod, the kind that said I saw exactly what happened in there. Later that afternoon, Mark came by my desk. His smile was polite but cold. You could have told me there was a new version. I met his gaze evenly. It was in the project channel yesterday, and maybe you missed it. He stared for a beat longer, then walked away. What he didn't realize was that the mistake had done more than just embarrass him in front of the client. It had planted a seed in the minds of both the client and our leadership. Mark wasn't as in sync with the project as he claimed, and that was exactly what I needed for the final stage. I wanted them questioning him before I ever laid my full case on the table. I wanted them to start seeing on their own the gap between his words and his actual involvement. Over the next week, that gap widened. He stopped getting CC'd on certain client emails. A few internal updates skipped him entirely. He noticed. And when a man like Mark notices his influence shrinking, he doesn't retreat, he pushes harder, which was perfect, because the harder he pushed, the more reckless he'd become. And soon, very soon, I'd be ready to close the trap for good. If you were in my position, would you have risked embarrassing him in front of the client like I did? Or would you have kept the confrontation purely internal? After the client meeting fiasco, Mark's presence in the office changed. He was still everywhere in hallways, in the break room, in any conversation that could be leveraged, but there was a new urgency in the way he inserted himself. Before he'd been patient, a slow and steady parasite who could afford to bide his time. Now, he was cornered. And cornered people move differently. I started seeing him pop into meetings he'd never cared about before, the marketing huddles, finance updates, even HR planning sessions. He'd sit and contribute nothing of value, then casually drop my name alongside his own as if to stitch our reputations back together. It wasn't working. The client had specifically requested me as the sole point of contact for Atlas moving forward. Leadership had started coming directly to me for updates, bypassing him entirely. Even his usual allies, the ones who'd believed his mentorship narrative, were a little cooler toward him. I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried something big to reassert dominance. What I didn't know was how perfectly he'd play into my hands when he did. The opportunity came in the form of the quarterly executive review, an internal meeting where department heads and senior managers present key wins challenges and strategic priorities for the next quarter. It's one of those meetings where reputations are cemented or quietly dismantled. Atlas was on the agenda, and I was set to present. 3 days before the review, Mark stopped by my desk, all smiles. Hey, I heard you're presenting Atlas in the review. Since we've worked so closely on it, how about I handle the strategic overview and you take the operational details? It was the perfect setup. Sure, I said, as if the thought had never occurred to me. I'll send you my draft notes. The notes I sent him were exactly what I wanted him to have, a blend of accurate background and one glaring fabricated future initiative buried deep in the bullet points. I called it the tiered global expansion model, a concept that sounded impressive but was entirely made up. I framed it as something under consideration, but stressed it was confidential and still being vetted internally. 2 nights before the review, I stayed late at the office. From my desk, I saw Mark in the small conference room, again blinds drawn, phone pressed to his ear. I couldn't make out the whole conversation, but I caught 3 words that confirmed everything: tiered, global, expansion. He was going to use it. The morning of the review, I arrived early and double-checked my presentation deck, the real one scrubbed of any mention of the fabricated model. I also made sure the meeting was being recorded for the official minutes, as it always was. When it was our turn, Mark went first. He spoke with that same practiced charm, walking the executives through the strategic vision of Atlas. He was careful to weave in his supposed guidance, framing the project as a collaborative triumph, his favorite trick. Then he said it. One of the most exciting opportunities we've been developing is the tiered global expansion model. This will allow us to... He went on for a full 2 minutes detailing my invented plan like it was gospel. He even added a timeline which conveniently matched one of our confidential contract terms, a term he should never have shared in an open forum. I let him finish my face, the picture of polite interest. When it was my turn, I stood, clicked to my first slide, and said, just to clarify for the record, the tiered global expansion model isn't an approved initiative. It was a preliminary brainstorming idea I mentioned to Mark privately, and it's not in any current roadmap. The CFO's head snapped toward him. Then why was it presented as if it were part of our active strategy? Mark stammered. Well, I thought the COO cut him off. Mark, if it's not approved and it's being discussed externally, we need to know exactly how and where that information is being shared. Silence. I continued with the real presentation, every slide tightening the noose. I highlighted confirmed wins, verified data, and next steps, all with clean documentation that left no room for embellishment. By the end, the CEO thanked me directly. Excellent work, Ryan. Keep driving this forward. Mark didn't get a single question. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk, slowly letting him stew. 10 minutes later, HR asked me to step into a private call. They wanted to clarify a few details about the tiered global expansion model and how it had come up. I told them the truth, that it was a hypothetical scenario mentioned only once in a private conversation with Mark, never documented, never shared with anyone else. I also mentioned carefully, without overt accusation, that I'd noticed similar situations in the past where details I'd only shared with him had surfaced elsewhere. They thanked me and said they'd follow up. Over the next week, I saw the ripple effects. Mark was excluded from Atlas entirely. His name stopped appearing in meeting invites. HR conducted informal interviews with people who'd worked with him. Danielle and Greg, my quiet allies, confirmed they'd been asked about similar experiences. I didn't need to see the investigation report to know the writing on the wall. Mark had built his career on a story where he was the architect of other people's success. Now that story was unraveling, not because I'd shouted him down, but because I'd let him narrate himself straight into the truth. And the truth, once it's spoken in the right room, is hard to take back. If you were in my shoes, would you have fed him that final piece of bait, or would you have gone to HR earlier with the proof? Once the quarterly review ended, the momentum shifted quickly. I could almost feel the air change around Mark. In the days that followed, his usual circuit through the office grew shorter. He lingered less at desks, laughed less loudly in the break room, and avoided eye contact with certain executives altogether. The man who once seemed to have an open invitation to every conversation now found himself circling the periphery. It wasn't just my imagination. I started noticing subtle signals. His name no longer appeared on the Atlas project updates, not in the email subject lines, not in the CC fields, not even in casual Slack threads. When the client sent over a mid-phase request, it came to me directly. There was no looping Mark in anymore. By midweek, HR had quietly scheduled follow-up meetings with people who'd worked under or alongside him. Danielle texted me. They just asked me about my sponsorship project from last year. I think they're building a case. Greg sent me a similar message. They wanted copies of my original proposals, the ones Mark revised. It was happening. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It was becoming a pattern in HR's files, corroborated by multiple people. Still, I didn't let myself get overconfident. Mark was slippery. If there was any way to spin this in his favor, he'd find it. But I could tell his footing was gone when he tried to corner me by the elevator. Listen. He began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I know the last few weeks have been awkward, but if we stick together, we can get past this. Past this. As if it were a minor misunderstanding we could just laugh about. I'm focused on Atlas, I said, simply stepping into the elevator. His smile faltered as the doors closed. That Friday, I was pulled into an unscheduled meeting with my manager and the COO. The tone was professional, but I could tell they were testing the waters. We appreciate how you've handled the Atlas project, the COO said. Given the current restructuring, we'd like you to step in as interim lead on a couple of Mark's other accounts. I kept my expression steady. Of course, happy to help wherever I'm needed. In reality, I knew exactly what restructuring meant. Mark was being eased out piece by piece while the investigation wrapped up. They weren't going to risk keeping him in control of anything sensitive. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself in rooms I'd never been invited to before. High-level strategic discussions, budget allocation meetings, even preliminary talks about next year's expansion roadmap. My voice wasn't just being heard, it was being sought out. It was surreal and a little sobering how quickly the tide had turned. Meanwhile, Mark's isolation grew. I'd pass him in the hallway and see him scrolling his phone, lingering in empty conference rooms as if waiting for someone who'd never arrive. His allies, the ones who'd once laughed at his jokes and nodded along with his mentorship stories, now gave him polite, distant smiles before finding a reason to walk away. The man who had thrived on perception was watching his carefully constructed image dissolve. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of him in the small conference room, blinds open this time, staring at a folder on the table. He wasn't on the phone, he wasn't working, just sitting there. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the boardroom where he'd called me his protege, the client meeting where he'd presented outdated data as if it were mine, the countless smaller moments where he'd chipped away at my credibility to build his own. No, sympathy wasn't on the table. The investigation moved quietly, but word spread fast enough in a place like ours. People didn't know the details, but they knew something was coming. I could hear it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room. By the end of the month, the COO called me back in. "We're finalizing some changes in leadership," she said. "Your work on Atlas has been exemplary, and your ability to maintain professionalism through recent events hasn't gone unnoticed. We'd like you to take over full leadership of the project portfolio Mark's been managing." It took everything in me to keep my voice even. I'd be honored. When I left her office, I didn't go back to my desk right away. I walked to the far end of the building where the big windows overlooked the city. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. This wasn't just about winning Atlas anymore. It wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about reclaiming every piece of ground I'd lost to someone who thought my success was his to control. And now, with his accounts in my hands and his network in ruins, the only thing left was the official announcement that I suspected would come soon. And when it did, I wouldn't need to say a word. Everyone would already know how we got here. If you were in my position, would you take over all of his accounts like I did, or would you just focus on your own projects and let the rest go? By the time the investigation reached its final week, the tension in the office was thick enough to taste. Conversations quieted when Mark passed by. HR's glass-walled office became a revolving door of managers and department heads, and Atlas was humming along under my lead without a hitch, something I knew wasn't going unnoticed. I didn't need an official update to know where things were headed. The signs were all around me. Mark no longer lingered in the hallways. He stopped dropping by desks to offer advice. Even the break room, his old stage for casual influence, seemed off limits to him now. If I saw him at all, it was in the late afternoon, slipping in and out of meetings that looked more like interrogations than strategy sessions. Still, part of me expected him to make one last desperate move. It's what people like him do, try to rewrite the ending before the ink dries. That moment came on a Tuesday morning. I just finished an early call with the Atlas client when I got a message from my manager mandatory company, meeting at 11 a.m. in the main conference room. Mandatory company meetings are rare here. When they happen, it's because something significant and usually not good is about to be announced. I arrived early, not wanting to miss a single detail. The room filled quickly. People murmured in low voices, glancing toward the door, like they were waiting for the curtain to rise on a performance none of us had bought tickets for. At 11:03, the COO entered with the HR director. A moment later, Mark walked in behind them. He looked smaller. Not physically, he still had that upright, confident posture, but the energy was gone. The easy smile, the casual charm, the aura of someone who believed the room belonged to him. All of it had evaporated. The COO spoke first. Her tone was steady, almost gentle, but the weight behind her words left no room for interpretation. Over the past several weeks, we've conducted a thorough review of certain concerns brought to our attention regarding the handling of intellectual property project credit and client communications. We take these matters seriously. After careful consideration, the decision has been made to part ways with Mark effective immediately. There was no drama, no drawn-out list of offenses, just a clean surgical cut. Mark stood there, expression unreadable as she continued. We thank him for his contributions during his time here and wish him the best in his future endeavors. It was the kind of line companies always use: polite, professional, and utterly final. Then the HR director stepped in to handle the logistics security access revoked by end-of-day transition of his accounts to me and two other managers, questions to be directed to her office. Mark didn't argue, didn't protest. He just nodded, once turned and walked out of the room. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, of course, the quiet, deep satisfaction of seeing justice carried out exactly as it should be. But there was also something else. A reminder that behind every downfall, no matter how deserved, there's a human being watching their world close in on them. Still, I couldn't ignore the truth. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was the inevitable end to a career built on borrowed credit and blurred lines. The meeting ended quickly after that. People filed out in clusters, their voices low but urgent. Some were shocked. Others, the ones who'd been on the receiving end of his mentorship, looked relieved. Danielle caught up to me in the hallway. "You did it," she said quietly. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "He did it to himself." She gave me a look that said she knew better. That afternoon, I was officially named as the permanent lead on Atlas and 3 of Mark's former accounts. The announcement went out in an internal email from the COO, congratulating me on demonstrated leadership, strategic clarity, and commitment to collaborative success. I read it twice, letting the words sink in. When I left the office that evening, I passed by the small conference room, the one where I'd first overheard Mark's suspicious calls. The blinds were open now. The table was bare. It struck me then that the real trap I'd set for Mark wasn't the fake strategies or the decoy slides. It was patience. Letting him speak long enough, often enough, until his own words became the evidence. And in the end, all I had to do was make sure the right people were listening. If you were in my place, would you have felt any sympathy at that final moment, or would it have been pure satisfaction? The first week after Mark was gone felt different, quieter. Not just in the literal sense, though it was true. The constant hum of his voice in hallways and impromptu mentoring sessions had vanished, but in the way the whole office seemed to breathe easier. There was no one circling the periphery of meetings waiting for a chance to insert themselves. No one slipping into conversations with executives to claim a sliver of someone else's credit. For the first time in a long time, work felt like work, not a performance I had to defend against. Atlas kept moving forward smoother than ever. Without Mark's interference, decisions were cleaner, timelines tighter. The client noticed. In one of our check-in calls, their COO said, "It's been great to see such consistent leadership, Ryan. Everything feels more direct. That was the word I'd been working toward without even realizing it. In the weeks that followed, I was busier than I'd ever been, not just with Atlas, but with the accounts I'd inherited. Each came with its own set of challenges, but they were mine now, my responsibility, my name on every deliverable, every decision. And I protected that fiercely. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about respect for the work, for the people putting in the effort, and for myself. I kept detailed records, not because I expected another Mark, but because I knew the value of a clear, undeniable trail. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about him, wondering where he'd end up if he'd try the same tactics somewhere else, if anyone there would spot him sooner. Part of me hoped they would. Another part knew people like Mark often land on their feet, at least for a while. Charm and confidence go a long way in places where perception matters more than proof, but proof wins in the end. I thought back to all the moments where I could have confronted him head-on, the first time he inserted himself into my work, the first stolen email, the first meeting where he claimed my ideas as his own. And I knew why I hadn't, because confrontation would have been noise, and noise is easy to dismiss. What I needed was clarity. A story so well documented, so consistent that it told itself. That's the part people underestimate about revenge. It's not always about the strike. Sometimes it's about the setup, the patience to let someone build their own gallows and then hand them the rope without saying a word. One evening, long after most people had gone home, I found myself standing in that small conference room again, the one where I'd first overheard him talking to Halden. The blinds were open now, letting in the city lights. The table was empty, the chairs neatly pushed in. But in my mind, I could still see him there, leaning over the table, voice low, thinking no one was listening. And I smiled because I knew better. The truth is, Mark didn't just underestimate me. He underestimated everyone he stepped on along the way. Danielle, Greg, the others, they'd all been watching quietly, storing their own evidence, waiting for someone to connect the dots. I just happened to be the one who decided enough was enough. If there's one thing I took away from all of this, it's that you can't control how other people act. You can't stop someone from being manipulative or from trying to take credit for work they didn't do, but you can control how you respond. And for me, the response wasn't rage or open war. It was patience, preparation, the slow, methodical building of a case until the truth became so obvious it didn't need defending. The day the official email went out naming me as lead on Atlas and the other accounts, I didn't forward it to anyone. I didn't post about it online. I didn't make a speech in the break room. I just closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the weight of the past few months lift off my shoulders. Because the real victory wasn't the title or the accounts or even the quiet satisfaction of watching Mark walk out of that conference room for the last time. The real victory was knowing that every step of the way I'd stayed in control of my story and made sure no one could ever rewrite it for me again. Have you ever had someone take credit for your work and try to pass it off as their own? How did you handle it by confronting them directly or by waiting for the right moment to prove the truth? Share your story in the comments.